My name's Steve Pettis. I'm with the Gwinnett County Extension Service. I'm the ag agent over there. You've met Steve Brady, who is the Cobb County agent, and Todd Hurd, who's the Cherokee County agent. And the gentleman who spoke to you this morning was Randy Drinkard, a retired county extension agent who comes back and does this for kicks, if you can believe it. I'm going to cover several chapters out of the Category 24 book. The cultural management of ornamentals and turfgrass, and also diseases of ornamentals and turfgrasses. And we're going to have to go through it pretty fast. I got a couple slides on basic certification requirements. I think Randy probably talked to you guys about this, but just to remind you that you need both a commercial pesticide license and a contractor's license if you're going to get paid to apply pesticides to somebody else's property for money. The commercial applicator's license, the pesticide license, if you hold that by itself, allows you to purchase restricted use pesticides and use it on maybe your employer's property or your own, but not on customers where you get paid for the job. So remember that. And that includes just anything from Roundup to Amdro, or even pre-emergent herbicides. It's considered a pesticide. You can go to the Georgia Department of Ag website, and your customers can go here as well. They can look you up once you're licensed. They can see if you have a license or not. They can find your information on here, your not personal information, but they can find out what counties you operate in. And whether you do hold a valid pesticide license. And you can give them a call at that phone number. You can take it 3 times a year if you mess up on it this time. If you pass the general standards and you don't pass the Category 24 or whatever category it is you're taking today, then you only need to take the category over. You don't need to retake the general standards over. But we know all you guys are going to pass. I don't need to cover that. But I will cover recertification. I'm sure that you guys know all about the certification process because you're doing it right now. But recertification, you must get 10 hours of continuing education credit every 5 years to maintain your license. And you get that by attending trainings that county agents and other organizations have gotten approved through the Department of Agriculture to give you hours. So, and they're usually only 1 to 3 hours each. Every once in a while, once a year, we'll put on a 5-hour credit, day-long. It's similar to this, day-long presentation where you can get 5 hours, but most of the time you only get them in 1s, 2s, and 3s. So keep that in mind. We get lots of people come up to us at the very end when they've only got 6 months left and want to get all 10 of their hours, and that's extremely difficult to do because the training just is spread out over the year. It's very hard to get it all at once. So keep that in your mind. Also, if you have licenses in other states, you can get a reciprocal. If it's a southeastern state, you can get a reciprocity agreement license here for $25. Introduction to pest management. And what you'll see on all the presentations today is we'll have the page numbers on the slide that the information came off of. So that's kind of helpful for you if you need to look up anything to clarify it in your mind. Integrated Pest Management, or IPM, is the pest management philosophy we encourage everyone to use. That philosophy states that when you run into a pest problem, you use all control options at your disposal prior to pesticides, but not excluding pesticides, but using pesticides as a last resort. The whole purpose is to reduce usage of pesticides and to increase the use of other management. The first thing in pest management is, what is the problem? You got to know what the problem is before you can treat it. So diagnosis is important. You can turn to the county extension agents in your county to do this for you. We all have disease labs. We can identify diseases on plants. We can take digital pictures, all of these things. But you need to know what the problem is. Chemical damage can, by misapplication of a fertilizer, can often look like brown patch, or cold damage can look like a gray spot or something, a gray leaf spot. So it's very important to identify what the problem is, because you're either going to waste your money or your customers if you don't apply the right action. The second thing, once you decide what pest you got to decide what to do about it. Those are action choices. We talked about one of the basic principles of IPM, and that's identifying of the pest. The other one is, that's really one of the major items, is produce healthy plants. Happy plants equal healthy plants. So if you can keep a plant healthy and vigorous, it can fight off many pests. We talked about identifying the problem. Set your threshold limits. Allow for some damage if you can. I know that in some customers' yards they can't stand one little thing wrong, or on golf courses they want everything to be perfect. But in general, most people can deal with just a little bit of damage, and if you're able to do that, then maybe you can hold off on sprays. And again, pesticides are considered a last resort, although they are oftentimes what we need to go to, and that's why we're here for this training. And the goal is not to eliminate every pest, but to keep damage to an acceptable level. What's the problem? Is it a pest? You see this little picture on the right, all this brown damage on turf? It's Bermuda grass. It looks like a disease to me. Upon further inspection, it come to find out it's the property's on a corner. Everybody that walks their dog walks right through this guy's corner, and they pee on his grass. And that's dog urine. But it looks a lot like a disease when you first walk up on it. So it's very important to identify the problem, or you're going to waste your time and your customer's money. I always carry a hand lens when I go in the field. That's a great way to identify pests. Keep a small magnifying glass, 10x or 20x in your pocket. I keep mine on a lanyard when I go in the field. I just throw it around my neck. And it's very helpful in identifying pests. Index cards detect mites. You can tap flowers over the top of the index card, and mites will fall out. And you can submit samples to the county extension agents. Also recognize that there are indicator plants around. That there are some plants that are going to get pests first, because they're either favored by that pest, or that plant's particularly susceptible. For instance, a rose. If you're scouting for Japanese beetles on your properties, that's the first thing I would look at, are roses. So those would be considered indicator plants, and keep good records. You all probably know the Department of Agriculture requires you to keep your records for 2 years. I would keep them forever, because you never know when somebody's poodle is going to go legs up, and they're going to blame you for a pesticide application that you put on somebody else's yard next door. So you want to keep accurate records and write down what the weather conditions were like, whether it was windy, rainy, what you applied, how much you applied, what time of day it was, all of these things, so that when you have to go back to those records, you know exactly what you did. And if somebody is looking into it, they'll look at there in your list and go, well, this person did exactly what they were supposed to do. There's no culpability here. So very important to keep records. Very, very important. Even private applicators, which is one of the other certification, pesticide certifications you can get. That allows you to apply pesticides to your own property. So if you were a farmer, that's the license you would get. Even those guys are required to keep records. Action choices are your control options. You can do things culturally. That means how you grow the plant. You can let biocontrol take over. There's a lot of insects that can control a lot of pests. Mechanical is simply weeding and things like that, hand pulling of weeds. And then finally, chemicals. One of the main things I want to point out as far as application and mixing is to minimize drift. And drift is the movement of pesticides off the targeted either property or plant or crop. This can happen very easily, very easily. I get lots of samples in of Trimac damage on shrubs from when it was windy. And the guy sprayed this yard next to the flowers, and the wind was blowing this way, and it took out a whole bunch of shrubs. They'll be all curled up. And the Department of Agriculture, if a customer decides to take it all the way, the Department of Agriculture will send an inspector, like the lady who will give you the test today, to the property, take samples, and they can test for the herbicides. That happens quite often. You'd be surprised how much it happens. We try to just get the people to work together and work it out without having to go to that extreme, but that can be done. So minimize drift. Don't spray when it's windy. Try to spray early in the morning before the wind kicks up in the springtime. We all know that it gets windy almost every day in the spring, and it's real hard to find a good time to spray, but try to use caution. Particle drift, of course, is like dusts, and vapor drift would be liquids and gases. Protect people when you're applying pesticides. Avoid resistance. Resistance is a pest resistance to a chemical. If you apply the same chemical over and over and over again, the pests that it doesn't kill are not susceptible to the chemical. And so when they breed, their offspring are not susceptible, and eventually the whole population loses susceptibility to a chemical. It can happen very fast in an animal or an insect that propagates millions a year. So you have to use caution. Try to rotate chemicals when you can. Evaluate tape mixes to make sure they're not dangerous. And read the label, read the label, read the label. That's the main thing you need to take out of pesticide safety, like Randy said earlier, his closing statement. Cultural management for turf grasses. Again, we talked about the first step of IPM is to keep plants healthy. And that's why we're going to talk about the cultural management of turf and ornamentals. I'm going to cover it basically because most of you people are in the field doing this stuff. And so there's nothing I probably couldn't tell you about turfgrass management. But I'm still going to cover the basics just to kind of refresh it for you. Use proper cultivars. Select the right grass for the right spot. Fescue is a cool season grass. It's very difficult to get it to grow south of I-20, where it gets so hot, and even where we are in Metro Atlanta is sort of a transition area. It does okay, but it still has problems. It does much better up in the mountains than it does in middle or south Georgia. So that's an example of selecting the right turf grass. Use warm season grasses in the south. And conversely, you wouldn't use Bermuda grass in the northern part of the country. Prepare the site properly when planting. The most important thing with cultural management of turf grasses is the proper mowing, thatch removal, and aerification, and proper irrigation. I talked about climbing a little bit, about choosing the right turf grass, but also what's the site going to be used for? Is it going to be residential, athletic fields, passive areas, parks, playgrounds, a school campus? Recognize that there are climatic regions in Georgia. It's like going to a different country when you go from South Georgia to North Georgia, and I'm not just talking about culturally. The weather in South Georgia, you can grow tropicals outside. In North Georgia, you can grow apples, which are considered a cool season kind of a fruit. So very different. Our state and a lot of these three southern states that are shown all have that particular characteristic, which makes our state interesting to work in, to say the least. And choose the right cultivar for the area. Site preparation, I'm not going to talk too much about that, except consider soil testing prior to planting. Soil test. I can't emphasize that enough to establishing a good management excuse me, good fertility management, especially on turfgrass. This is a service the Extension Service performs. You bring samples in, and for a small fee, we send them off and have them analyzed at our lab in Athens at the university. It comes back with a nice report that tells you exactly what you need to do, exactly how much lime, exactly how much fertilizer, and which ones to use. I highly recommend that as the basis of any management regime. Assure drainage and consider airflow, humidity, and shade. There's no air that's going to blow through that crowded up row of lealands right there on the right-hand side, and that's going to affect you on hot, humid days when the air is not moving, as far as your susceptibility to diseases in that turfgrass stand. Proper mowing. Remember, remove 1/3 or less of a blade of grass when you're cutting. If you go over 1/3, you stress the plant, and that makes it more susceptible to diseases. This is an extremely basic thing that a lot of people don't do. I think that companies do a very good job of it. Homeowners do not. They let it grow up to their ankles before they mow. And every time you mow, you stress the grass out, especially during the hot, dry seasons. Dethatching. Thatch is the organic layer of clippings that builds up on top of the soil. You want to make sure that stays less than a 1/2 inch thick. If you're mowing properly, that should never happen. Should never build up on you. Aerating. That's basically punching holes in the soil so airflow can move down into the soil. Coring is one of the best ways to do that. Fertilizing and irrigation. Cultural management of ornamental plants. We talked a little bit about the climates in Georgia. If you've never heard of it, the USDA has a hardiness map. Hardiness is basically how low of a temperature can that plant withstand. Some of the problems we get in trouble with here is planting things, northern conifers here in this area during the hot, dry summers don't do very well. So consider where the plant can live and consult hardiness maps. You can find all that information in textbooks. Consider microclimates. If somebody lives next to a stream, they're going to have a little different climate than a guy who lives on top of a bald hill. Consider sunlight and shade, soil moisture and drainage, soil pH, and pest susceptibility. And always inspect your stand of turf. Inspect your ornamental plants and your turf. When you start out with bedding plants, transplant them properly to avoid damaging prior to planting. Space them 6 to 8 inches apart, and be careful not to pile the mulch up too high along the base of the plants. How to plant trees and shrubs. Once again, this is very basic, but this is oftentimes the root of many, many problems I see when people bring in samples to my office. They'll bring in a dead azalea, and there'll be soil up 3 inches up the stem from where they had planted it that far too deep. So you want to make sure that the root ball is even with the soil line, and that when you take it out of the pot, you cut any girdling roots. I usually make 4 vertical cuts down the side of the root ball with a knife, and that keeps girdling roots from establishing themselves in the ball hole. Care of newly installed plants. Don't let the plants dry out, of course. When people ask me how much to water, that's what I tell them. Just don't let it dry out completely. It's very hard to give someone a recommendation. 1 inch a week for turfgrass. Water thoroughly once a week for trees and shrubs. That's sort of a rule of thumb. Pruning, if you do any pruning, you want to prune lightly. And fertilizing, I usually recommend not using much fertilizer, if any at all, at planting. Wait till the plant gets established. Like I said earlier, fertilizing established plants. I didn't say this earlier, but fertilizing established plants, especially trees and shrubs, is not always necessary. If you consider a pansy, which is an annual, a high nitrogen user, a high fertility plant, they need lots of fertility. An oak tree in a landscape is not a high fertility plant. And it doesn't really benefit from lots and lots of nitrogen. So fertilizing every year is not necessary. You might want to base your fertility choices on a soil test. That would help. Fertilizer rates vary by plant type and age, location, and growth rate. If it's a slow-growing plant, it doesn't need a lot of fertilizer. And apply at the right time of year. I don't recommend applying fertilizer after August to established landscape plants. And I don't recommend applying prior to March or April because if there's a lot of nitrogen in the soil, this goes for turfgrass as well, then if you get that warm spell that we almost always get in February where it gets up to 70 degrees, those plants are going to start growing if there's plenty of nitrogen in the ground. Then it's going to get cold again for 2 months, and it's very likely you can get cold damage on plants when they've got lots of new little growth coming out. Mulches, I'm not going to talk much about mulches. Just know that mulches provide some nutrients as they break down. They reduce weeds, they conserve moisture, they keep roots cooler, and they definitely improve the appearances of landscape plantings. We talked a little bit about watering. Established plants, shrubs, and trees infrequently, but deep. Same for turf. We turf an inch a week, and the best time to apply irrigation is from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. And if we continue to have water restrictions, which we are going to probably have forever now, you have to water after certain hours. So check your local municipality for when you can water. Prune properly. That's the point of this one is to recognize that a tree has a branch collar. That's the swollen area that supports the branch at the trunk. If you prune inside of that takes the plant much, much longer to heal the wound, and that makes the tree more susceptible to disease and insects. Whereas if you prune outside the branch collar, it will rapidly grow over the hole. Mulch is also useful at preventing mower damage around trees. That's the beginning of a lot of problems with trees. You get a lot of wood rotting organisms that attack the tree. And that's the cultural methods of raising plants properly. Disease management on turfgrass and ornamentals. Terms to know, disorders versus diseases. A disorder is an irregular plant development caused by unfavorable growing conditions. It's not infectious, does not spread from plant to plant. A disease, on the other hand, is a plant problem caused by a pathogen, and a pathogen is anything that causes disease. That includes fungi, bacteria, and viruses, and these can spread from plant to plant. So that's the difference between a disorder and a disease. To have any pest problem, including weeds, insects, and diseases, you need to have three things. You need to have a susceptible host, you need to have the pest, and you need to have the perfect environment. Out of those three things, the one you can change the most on an existing stand of, say, turf would be the environment. If somebody's getting Pythium on fescue, that means they've got too much water, maybe they're irrigating too often. You can change that pretty easily and get rid of the disease. Then that's called the disease pyramid. You're going to see that probably a lot over, if you continue to do trainings, people are going to mention that a lot. We talked about integrated pest management. Integrated disease management is just sort of more narrow focus of that. Managing the host. Select a cultivar that is well adapted to the site. Consider planting a mixture of compatible cultivars for turf. Apply fertilizer when needed, and use sharp blades and proper mowing procedures. Manage the environment. Make sure that the irrigation is deep, but you allow some time for the soil to dry out between waterings. That period of those wet, dry cycles can keep a lot of diseases from forming. Make sure there's plenty of airflow, good drainage. You reduce compaction through aerification, and remove thatch. When you're talking about diseases of turf grasses, you talk about fungicides. You have protectant fungicides, which basically prevent diseases from happening, and then you have systemic fungicides, which move through the plant. You apply it to the soil or even the leaves, and it goes into the plant and gets translocated throughout the plant. Signs and symptoms. A sign of a disease is a mushroom or some white, fluffy mycelial growth. Symptoms are things like the tree's wilting, the tree's turning yellow, or the grass is turning yellow. That's signs and symptoms. And then you have stand symptoms. You can separate symptoms into stand and plant symptoms. Stand symptoms, when you're looking at turfgrass, you see big spots, broad circles, patches, rings, arcs, general yellowing throughout the whole stand, that sort of thing. When you're talking about plant symptoms, you're talking about when you're looking at individual plants, they've got leaf spots and lesions, stem lesions, foliar blights, dieback, crown, and root rot. The signs would be considered, like I said, the fungus itself, and the symptoms would be what it does to the plant. Now we're going to just cover some diseases specifically. Brown patch, the most common disease that we see in Georgia for sure. That's when I get the vast majority of my samples that come in are brown patch. It's common on fescue, but I see it a lot on other grasses as well. But it attacks cool season grasses mostly, and it attacks them during warm, humid weather. And conversely, it attacks warm season grasses when it's cool and wet. Anytime it rains, if you look at the weather and you know it's going to rain for 3 to 5 days, and the temperatures are going to be less than 85 degrees, you know that you've got the possibility of this disease creeping up on you. Avoid high nitrogen, avoid excessive water, and fungicides do work on this disease. So if you get diagnosed with it, fungicide applications can bring it back. And if you'll notice on that one and this one, it basically looks the same, and it really, this is large patch, and the reason they look the same is because they're actually caused by the same disease, the same fungi, but because they happen at different times of year, and they've kind of broken out into a separate disease. But if you notice, and you noticed it on the last picture too, the center of the patch will start to green up again. That's a very classic symptom of brown patch or either large patch. That's we call that the wagon ring, and you'll notice a smoky colored circle around the outside of the patch. The turf can become brown or yellow or orange. I say it's straw colored. That's the way I remember it. It's colored like dead grass. Cool, wet weather. Don't fertilize in late summer. Keep thatch below ½ inch, and fungicides can help if you apply them in the fall. Dollar spot, another very, very, very common disease on turf. Warm, humid weather. This stuff can pop up real quick. Nitrogen-starved turf. This is usually an indicator that someone is not managing their fertility properly. When it's hot and humid, or cool and humid in the morning, you'll see, if you go out there, you'll see little spiderweb-like mycelial growth. And that's just the body of the fungus. It actually comes out and tries to spread around. What that can tell you is that you have dollar spot. If you mow early in the morning when it's wet, you can spread it all over the place. So if you're going to mow dollar spot, you want to try to wait till it's dry. Use resistant turf grass, apply nitrogen properly, mow properly, and fungicides. I guess you're probably starting to see a pattern here. Mow properly, aerate properly, keep the thatch layer to where it should be. Fairy rings. If this disease doesn't make the mushrooms, it looks very much like a bad case of brown patch. Big circles in the yard. The difference is this isn't necessarily a pathogen. It doesn't attack the grass. What it does is it grows in thatch, the decomposing organic matter in the soil. And this is all your toadstool forming, or many of your toadstool forming fungi. And there's hundreds. So it doesn't necessarily have to be big ones. They can be little ones that you can't see. That if you pull back the turf, you'll look under there, you'll see little mushrooms growing. But what they do is a spore starts in one spot, it grows out, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. As it's decomposing the thatch layer, it releases nitrogen so you can get a greening up of the ring. The grass will grow even taller in that spot, and that ring will move. It's pretty neat to see, but it's very difficult to get rid of. You kind of have to let it run its course. On golf courses, if they ever get this on a green, then they basically have to rip the whole green out. There are fungicides now that are getting better at controlling it, but the main thing is to reduce your thatch layer, mow properly, which builds up thatch, and sometimes you see these associated with old stumps, like on building sites where they pushed up the stump, left all the roots in the ground. You'll see this associated with that sometimes. Snow mold, pink snow mold, it attacks cool season grasses. By the name, you probably can figure that we won't see this disease too often, but after a particularly cold winter, you can see this, especially on cool season grasses and especially on golf courses. They see it a lot. And that's because it is related to the amount of fertilizer you use. If you use excessive amounts of nitrogen after a cool winter, you could possibly get this. It has pink or gray edges, and you need to make sure you're fertilizing properly, you mow frequently and at the right height, and don't fertilize in cold weather if you have this disease. Gray leaf spot. This is a hot weather disease. It attacks whole stands of grass, so it's very much not a patch. Oh, and I didn't explain the difference between patches and spots. A spot, like dollar spot, is small, and a patch is a large spot. So I'm glad I cleared that up for you. Patches and spots and all these names get tossed around, but there are actually definitions to patches and spots, although they're very difficult to know what the disease looks like by that name. But the gray leaf spot is called that because it turns the stand this kind of strange gray looking once that gets covered in these little lesions, these little leaf spots. You see them in the top right corner. And the whole turf, before it gets really noticeable, just it'll get off colored. And then when you get really close to it, you'll notice that it's got all these spots on it. Very hot weather. The turf looks scorched. For this disease, just like all others, improve airflow and irrigate at the right time and avoid fertility when you have the disease. Helminthosporium disease is another hot weather leaf spot type disease that attacks the whole stand. Very, very, very common. This is one of the most common ones we see, especially in the dead of the heat of the summer. If somebody tells me they got brown patch in the summer, I can pretty much assure them that they don't. You usually get that in the spring or the fall. So a lot of the stuff you see in the summertime is Helminthosporium leaf spots. And this is another one of those diseases that if you know it's going to rain for several days and then get hot again, this is going to be a disease that you will see. Okay. Pythium blight, the scourge of golf courses. This is a water mold, and by that name you probably can figure that this grows when it's really wet. It attacks fescue a lot. This makes turf melt. So if it's cool and the turf begins to not just die standing up and be brown, that's usually like brown patch does. If it falls over, turns dark colored, and is mushy, then it's highly likely that it's Pythium. Attacks all cool season grasses, can damage large areas really quickly. And what it is, you don't notice that it's spread out so fast. Because it's a water mold, it can spread by rain. Its spores actually float in water, it can move around. This one's very, very dependent on water. So anything you can do to reduce the amount of water in the soil would help. Spring dead spot, this is sort of one that they exactly don't know everything about yet, but we're starting to see it more and more now that everybody's planting hybrid Bermuda grass because it's particularly susceptible, especially if people juice it up with nitrogen late in the season and we get really cold temperatures, we get a lot of this kind of damage. And when you take a disease sample of this, you'll find all kinds of fungi on it, and it's hard to tell which one it is actually causing it. But attacks Bermuda grasses in the transition zone, which is what we are. We're the transition between hot weather, hot season, warm season grasses, and cool season grasses. We can grow both here. Thatch promotes the disease. They're big patches. So you want to consider, if you're in the more northerly parts of the counties, the metro counties, you might consider trying turf that's not susceptible to this problem. Nematodes. Nematodes are microscopic worms. Nematodes are animals, so anything that kills a nematode will kill you and me. That's why nematicides are very difficult to get. Homeowners, it's not even an option for a homeowner. Golf courses use some, but these are tough critters to get rid of. They thin out turf, stands of turf, and make it weak. So you just see a general thinning, not really patches or spots or anything like that. Diseases of ornamentals are caused by just the same thing that causes diseases in turf: fungi, bacteria, viruses, and nematodes. Fungicide basics. We have protectant and systemic. Remember that. We talked about resistance. Fumigants can be used. These are gases that are injected into the soil, but again, these are always used as a last resort, and most people don't have the technology or the skills to use it, and they're very hard to purchase anyway, and they're about to be gone due to EPA regulations, so we're not even going to talk much about them. On ornamentals, which would be trees and shrubs, and annuals and perennials and things like that, you get leaf spots. Leaf spots can be caused by fungi and bacteria. One disease in particular, which affects things in the apple family, is scab. That would be crab apples, pyracantha, things like that. Basically, remove any fallen debris from the plant to keep that from reinfecting the plant again next year. Fungicides in the spring will help control it. Root rots. This is the vast majority of the diseases we see on ornamentals are root rots, and that's because people tend to overwater instead of underwater. During the drought, we lost more plants to root rot than we did to drought, even though it wasn't raining, so that tells you a lot. You have Phytophthora, Rhizoctonia. There's lots of diseases that are fungi that cause this type of disease, but they're all associated with excessive water and oftentimes with excessive fertility. You want to make sure that you have excellent drainage if you're growing things like azaleas that are highly susceptible to it. Leaf nematodes, foliar nematodes. We talked about nematodes that get on roots. Well, there's also nematodes that get on leaves. Nematodes are everywhere. They're all over you. They're all over everything. Little microscopic worms. They're the most common life form there is. If you took up all the nematodes and added them together, they would outweigh everything else added together that lives. I mean, they're everywhere. Most numerous things in the world. And foliar nematodes actually splash around in the rain. They're worms that are so small, when the rain splashes, it can splash it around. And then they burrow down into the leaf and feed on the interior of the leaf, causing this damage. This is a hosta. Hosta are particularly susceptible to this, but other herbaceous type ornamentals can be susceptible to this. And you definitely have to perform a proper lab analysis to know if you've got these guys. Powdery mildew is basically, looks like it sounds. It looks like somebody dusted the plant with flour. Powdery mildew affects lots of plants, but it really affects crab apples and crepe myrtles and dogwoods, euonymus and zinnia. Those are some of the most common ones. You want to use, you want to prune it out if you got it. There are fungicides that work, but you want to try to use resistant cultivars. Now there are crepe myrtles that have been bred to be resistant to this, and they don't get it nearly as bad. Different bacterial blights. The most common one you'll see is fire blight. This is what you see on pears. You'll see that that we call it a shepherd's crook symptom, or the end of the branch folds over like a hook, and they turn black like somebody went around and burned it with a blowtorch. Best thing to do for this is prune it out prior to leafing out in the spring, because it comes from that old dead stuff in the top of the tree every year. So if you prune it out, you can get rid of it. Vascular wilts are wilts that get into the interior of the plant. They're systemic. They cause the vascular system to get clogged up, the water to quit flowing in the plant, so it suffers from drought symptoms. Mimosas have got a real bad problem with this. Not that too many people grow them as an ornamental, but the people who do are experiencing some vascular problems. Fusarium wilt is the name of it. Another vascular problem, that vascular problem was caused by a fungi. This one's caused by a bacteria. And you'll see this a lot on sycamores. The University of Georgia campus is covered in sycamores that are covered in, they've got this problem. It's Xylella leaf scorch, or you can just call it bacterial leaf scorch. The bacteria propagates inside the tree, clogs up the xylem, and makes the tree look like it's dying of drought. And basically, there's nothing you can do about it except replace it with a tree that's not susceptible to that. And that concludes my portion of the talk.